Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, September 22nd, 2021. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Very happy to welcome you to this special event where we're previewing the Broadband Breakfast. Got some sound going on here, so just address this here. Okay, well, I'm a little. There we go. Okay. Maybe it was one of our guests here. No, it wasn't. Thought it was. Close down other windows. That solves the problem. When in doubt, close more windows. So once again, really happy to welcome you to this preview event. Our session here today is all about talking for the 5 days out, last minute we called it, guide or preview of Broadband Breakfast, our digital infrastructure investment event. We, in conjunction with Broadband Communities, are sponsoring a conference called Digital Infrastructure Investment, and that conference is taking place next Monday at 1 o'clock Eastern time. So let me back up a second, okay? Most of you who are here, either on our Zoom link or on our live stream link, because we stream this on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other channels, are familiar with our core programming, our Broadband Breakfast Live Online event series. We've been doing this for a year and a half now, every Wednesday at 12 noon. We started because of the pandemic as a way to bring people together in the midst of this the crisis that still continues, right? I mean, it's changed, it's transmogrified in many ways, many dimensions, in ways I'm sure none of us could have predicted. But what we do know is that high capacity broadband is even more important now than ever before. And that's the theme, if you will, for what we're trying to accomplish in this series, right? And so we will continue to do this. We'll continue to do this for the indefinite future. We will continue to do them for free, these live stream events, and make them available on our platforms, as well as recordings. So right after the program, it is available on the website that you likely registered to attend this event if you're here in the Zoom room, so to speak. So that's kind of step one, right? The next point I want to make is that we've recently begun doing hybrid events. Okay, so 2 weeks ago, we did our first Broadband Breakfast for Lunch event. We were live in person and we live streamed it. So starting at 12 noon Eastern time, we had a group of people in one place and we had the rest of you who were live online. Okay, so we've now taken a little baby step with hybrid events. Now we're going to go all in. Okay, so next Monday, 5 days from now, we are going to run a hybrid conference from 1 o'clock Eastern time, 12 noon Central time, to 6 p.m. Eastern time, 5 p.m. Central. 5-hour mini conference. It's on the first day of Broadband Communities. Okay, so if you are registered to attend Broadband Communities, you are already admitted, registered to attend our event. It's part of the Broadband Communities Summit. So if you aren't registered to attend and want to come to Houston and be with myself and others on this program who will be there, please go to the link on broadbandbreakfast.com, digital infrastructure investment. I put it out on the chat list earlier. I'm going to send it out again. That is the tool, and you can get the best rate, $349 to attend the whole week of Broadband Communities. Now, if you aren't able, or don't want to, or whatever reason, but to go there in person, but still want to participate in our hybrid event, you can do that and you can register. But we do ask for registrations. It is $149 to attend our mini conference. We look forward to welcoming many of you. Now, it's going to be a mini conference where we have both remote participants and remote speakers. Okay, so that's the new area of complexity. And I'm happy to welcome here and right now the other three moderators for our event on Monday. They are Joan Engebretson, executive editor of Telecompetitor, Christopher Mitchell, who is director of the Municipal broadband project at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and additionally, Mari Sibley of US Ignite. And since I closed down my windows because of that repeating sound, I'm not remembering your title. So Mari, would you be good enough to tell us your title again?
Sure. US Ignite probably is enough, but Senior Director of Partnerships and Outreach.
Well, wonderful. Mari, the Senior Director of Partnerships and Outreach, will be moderating panel 3 or panel 4 or topic 4. So I wanted to bring these moderators together because they will maybe have some questions, maybe have some ideas, maybe they'll be informed by your questions and your ideas. Those of you who are participating with us on Zoom, or again through any of our other platforms and live streams. And so what I want to do now is I want to just take a little minute to describe the conference and what we aim to accomplish. I'll take another 2 minutes here to just give the big picture, and then we'll turn it to Joan, who will tell us a little bit about her thoughts on this topic. She's been covering this intently for this topic of broadband and infrastructure intently for many years, and is certainly well qualified to moderate the next topic. So the topic 1. Well, to step back just a half step. We did this mini conference last year for the first time. We intended to do it at Broadband Communities, but they didn't have an in-person conference, so we were part of their online conference. And this event is bringing together the broadband infrastructure and financial services communities around the digital infrastructure and investment asset profile, including fiber, small cells, towers, data center assets. Okay, and so we're bringing together, both trying to and actually are bringing together the financial services community and the infrastructure developers, and we're doing so in a way that kind of, if you will, future proofs or future plans, because part of what we're speculating or believing is that there are going to be, and there are, new players in the field who are approaching network building perhaps differently from the vertically integrated model of, a single cable company or single telco that's owning the asset, operating the asset, and offering services. And we're seeing a diversification of that. We're seeing more open access models. For example, last year's conference featured Greg Mesh, the CEO of CityFibre, which is the 3rd largest provider of broadband services in the United Kingdom, and is doing so on a wholesale model. Well, okay, so for panel 1, focusing on infrastructure investment, I'll be moderating this panel, and we'll talk about the Biden administration's broadband infrastructure package, but we'll also talk about the other funds that have already been made available. We'll be talking about what people on the ground, like KeyBank Capital Markets, MC Partners, Frontbridge Capital, are seeing and doing and deploying in this space. So some of the questions I'm going to be interested in is how the broadband infrastructure plan, which is still, Senate passed, but not passed by the House, hasn't gotten to the point of regulation, how that's impacting the actual financial calculations that people who are building projects are making, right? Is that opening up new opportunities, or on the contrary, is it maybe changing or depressing? It's not strange to imagine that some projects that have been planned and modeled under one set of assumptions needs to be adjusted to accommodate another model. Anyway, that's the first panel, okay, that I'll be moderating. But then we'll move into last mile digital infrastructure, which speaks to these points. Joan, let me go ahead and turn it over to you to speak a little bit about your thoughts on this panel that you'll be moderating, questions that you have about it, kind of in your own journalistic curiosity, and maybe some things that you are looking to learn from those that you're speaking to when you moderate this session.
Sure thing. So I have a lot of really interesting panelists. This topic of last mile digital infrastructure is really hot now. I mean, everybody's trying to see how we can get broadband to everyone. And there are, there's a lot of creativity coming into this, where people are trying new models of deployment and so on. And so we have 3 service providers. One of the sort of pioneers in this area of looking for new ways of doing things and questioning assumptions was Google Fiber. And we have someone from Google Fiber, John Burchett, who's the head of public policy there for the Google Access and Google Fiber unit. Should be able to answer some questions about the sorts of things they looked for from cities before they would decide to deploy fiber there and so on. 2 other service providers are kind of up and comers. One is Ting. We have Monica Walsh, who's Senior Director of Market Development and Strategic Partnerships there. And at TACUS, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, we have Carter Old, who's co-founder, president, and chief growth officer, an interesting title for that company. So talking to them about, how they decide where to build and, anything new they're doing, questions about open access and those kinds of things. And then the other thing that's happening is we're seeing a lot of government money coming into broadband. You referenced the Senate infrastructure bill, which is probably the biggest example, but there's already quite a lot of money out there. The ARPA had money that went to the states, and some of them are directing a lot of it toward broadband. And so we have 2 entities, 2 public entities that received money through ARPA that'll be on the panel. One is Brownsville, the city of Brownsville. We have Ramiro Gonzalez, who's Director of Government and Community Affairs there. And the other is Julie Wheeler from York County. Both of those entities got quite a lot of funding from ARPA that they're going to use toward broadband. So I'll be talking to them about their plans for that. And I have questions about open access. I have questions about new business models, questions about the application process for getting government funding. So a lot of different things that I'm hoping we'll get to. We have 45 minutes and we have 5 people, so we should have plenty of material.
Great. No, thank you very much, Joan. Do you have a minute or two if we have a brief comments from Mari and from Chris and Mari, and then
Sure.
We'll have a little time together before I you need to.
Yeah, I actually could stay a little longer than I thought, so okay. No worries.
All right. We're very good. Thank you, Joan. So let's turn now to Chris Mitchell. For our audience, Chris Mitchell may not need any introduction, but I'm always happy to give an introduction. I probably should feature the fact that you are being recognized, if I read my emails correctly, Chris, for being one of the IP3 Visionaries awardees, a very, very significant award. They do one for intellectual property, one for internet policy, and one for
internet protocol.
Internet protocol, okay, and then one for internet for info. What's the third? What's the third IP?
It's internet protocol. Yeah, that's the third one.
Internet protocol,
you had it right.
Information, intellectual property, and anyway, you're definitely you are the awardee for this, and so congratulations, Chris, for that. That's quite an accomplishment. But tell us a little bit about what you do at Institute for Local Self-Reliance and how you're seeing this topic, both having participated last year at last year's conference and developments since then at this year's conference.
Sure. At the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, we do a lot of research and advocacy for local authority and decision-making in this. Some of our original research is focused on how cities have done it and how electric cooperatives and telephone cooperatives are working in this space. And I have to say, Joan's here, and Joan is someone who I burned one time accidentally with some original research we did, which she ran in as the headline of an article, and then I found out we'd made a significant mistake. So I'm ever grateful for Joan's professionalism in not being upset with us at that. So we tried to do original research, and that's hard. It turns out to get it, make sure you're getting it right. But we do a lot of things along those lines of just trying to help people figure out what's happening on the ground, whether that's media or whether that's people in other cities that are trying to move forward. One thing we've observed is that we're seeing a lot more evidence that cities are taking up the mantle. Sometimes they're building their own networks, or sometimes they're trying to partner with others, which is the subject of our panel, which is really going to be a really fun panel. We're talking about the role of cities in terms of doing the infrastructure projects, specifically with how they're looking to partner. We've got Matt Schmidt, a friend of mine, who is the director of the Illinois Office of Broadband, but previously was here in Minnesota and crafted what a state broadband policy, which has been the root of many others around the country. We have Chris Walker, who is the title is Senior Executive Director of Infrastructure Strategy for Northwest Open Access Network. NOAANet, Northwest Open Access Network in Washington, is this like 20-year history of doing really interesting open access networks. We have Nate Wolowitz, who is in Colorado, where I'm assuming he's involved with Project Thor. He's the Northwest.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the Northwest Colorado, with the Northwest Council of Governments. Northwest, I forget exactly. There's
Northwest
too many C's
Colorado
in his
Council of
abbreviations. Oh, okay, yeah, and Colorado just has really good policy on this. A lot of insight, a lot of partnership opportunities, and then we have Sunny Wright McPeak, who is the president and CEO of California's Emerging Technology Fund. And California is really hot right now, doing really interesting things, putting money into this. I mean, people really need to attend all the panels, but I think you put me in the middle because like we're the peak. Like we're gonna knock it over. It's just gonna be amazing. And I feel bad for Mari having to follow us, but I know that she's gonna do an amazing job.
Hey, I would argue that the only reason they put me in the last slot is because they knew they needed their strongest their strongest moderator and content to hold up the end there. So that'll be my argument. I'm sticking to it.
Sure, I think that's accurate.
Well, one of the things we certainly will get into or the panel, I suspect, Chris, in your panel, we'll get into is the role of states, right? And with both Matt Schmidt and Sunny McPeak, they'll speak to that. And you referenced Colorado. It's kind of funny that you mentioned Colorado's great. They are great. I mean, but they had this really bad law that restricted municipalities' ability to build networks. And yet, in a weird sort of twist, it's become almost an incentive. Do you want to talk just a minute or two about that, Chris?
Sure. In 2005, the company that's now known as CenturyLink and Lumen pushed a law in the state legislature that required a referendum before a city could engage in a partnership or build their own telecommunications network. It's actually worded in this really weird way. And technically, every city that is offering free Wi-Fi in their library without having passed a referendum is in violation of state law, but they all ignore it because that's crazy. So the state, for years, no one did it. And the first city that tried to do it, Longmont, in 2009, failed to pass the referendum because the cable and telephone companies dropped about $250,000, which at that point was a record for a local referendum. And it scared a lot of people into voting no. But 2 years later, they did another campaign because people had educated themselves over that time and realized that they actually wanted the city to do it. At that point, the big cable and telephone companies dropped about $500,000 to oppose the effort, which was a new record for a local effort. That this time the city voted like 59 or 62% or something like that in favor of the city doing it. Over time, the cities worked together to develop a playbook in which they had common language and had worked together on educational materials. And since then, there's been, 140 referenda between cities, counties, school districts, and others. And so it's actually an organizing point now. And so we do not consider it a barrier any longer, although it was a very strong barrier at one time. Things change, and some of these things can become worse or better barriers over time.
Well, and I think the argument would have to be some states. There's occasional moves like Ohio and the effort to kind of make restrictions. The trend has been the other way with more states, at least in terms of co-ops, allowing co-ops to do more. We can talk a little more about that just now, Chris, unless you want to jump in. But I'd love to hear, Mari, your thoughts on your topic, which by no means is a second tier, because really we can't forget the role that wireless plays and will continue to play in all manner of last mile connections and in smart cities. So Mari, talk a little bit about your background. You are at US Ignite, and I'm sure some of our watchers know something about that, but say a word or two about that, and then what you kind of are looking forward to or hoping to get out of the panel you'll be moderating.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm excited to be here with this set of moderators too. It's great. It's great to get to a point in one's career where you start continuing to overlap with certain people, regardless kind of what the house is. I was at Light Reading as a telecom reporter for a long time, and have been now at US Ignite for several years, which for those of you who don't know is a high-tech nonprofit focused on expanding broadband connectivity, smart city initiatives, but also the frontiers of wireless network research. And I kind of wear a bunch of hats from the perspective of what US Ignite does. I'm certainly involved very heavily on the community side. And as Chris Mitchell just put in there, we have a project Overcome right now, which has 7 communities that we are funding for pilot deployments of broadband infrastructure, creative pilot deployments, with the goal of learning as much as possible to determine what's replicatable elsewhere, replicable elsewhere, for connecting the unconnected. And we actually just had our first deployment out of that. Clinton County in Turney, Missouri, just announced yesterday their very first deployment, or their deployment as the first of the 7 communities within Project Overcome. So they're doing some interesting work with both intelligent routing and also RF over fiber. But in any case, a couple of hats, both working very closely with the communities, and then also as the program director for our Platforms for Advanced Wireless Research program, which is very interesting because it gives the look at kind of what's coming, probably still many, many years down the pike, but at least it's a glance into what the commercial world and communities and such will need to be thinking about going forward, kind of how the landscape is shifting. So for this panel in particular around shared infrastructure, the question it poses is, will 5G deployment accelerate the deployment of shared real estate facilities? And, obviously that depends on what you mean by 5G, but certainly where density needs are concerned with respect to those higher frequency bands in use, I would almost change the question to the panelists to how are these networks even possible without shared infrastructure? There's a resource efficiency there that's going to become incredibly important. As to whether or not that extreme density is necessary, that obviously depends on the use case. We are certainly used to operating with networks in terms of evaluating them based on coverage and sort of best effort capabilities. But at least in theory, there are applications coming where best effort won't be good enough. I heard an interesting comment in a symposium on 6G yesterday. I know, because we're not done with 5G, we have to start on 6G, about how incredibly important latency. Again, we barely, even though we talk about it in 5G, it's barely a thing in our everyday applications, but how important that's going to become in the move to 6G, that and heterogeneous networks. But among other things I'd like to hear about tomorrow from my panelists, kind of 2 big things. One is, what's the question?
Tomorrow or Monday?
Oh, sorry, Monday. Apologies.
You're giving me a heart attack.
Sorry. Next
we have
thing.
5 days. That's not many, 5, but it is 5 days. So that's
Sorry.
something. So go ahead.
Apologies for the heart attack there. But I'd like to sort of hear a little bit about what the impact of sort of new private networks are likely to be on the deployment of shared infrastructure, because certainly these smaller network footprints are going to be an opportunity to do a lot of experimenting with business models. And then naturally, I'm interested in the opportunity for municipalities to kind of, where their role is going to be in this concept of shared infrastructure. Both from a shared real estate asset perspective, but then also going, the step further into whether or not and how viable neutral host is, with the idea of the municipalities, working with partners to manage their assets and share them back with network operators in a way that typically the physical assets at the radio access network level haven't been shared. So a whole range of topics, and as you said, Drew, earlier, that the panelists are couldn't be more different, which is great. It means we'll have very different perspectives on the topics.
Right, and Mari didn't mention this, but we've got Jonathan Adelstein, the CEO of the Wireless Industry Association, and Deborah Simpierre, CEO and co-founder of Althea Networks, which is a really cool Bitcoin or cryptocurrency based deployment, decentralized wireless network. And there'll probably be another panelist or two on Mari's panel, but even with that, we've got a blockchain based a very good discussion. So, let's open up to each of you. Joan, in particular, you're kind of someone who's followed the twists and turns of telecom and broadband very closely over the years. What are some of your thoughts about the funding landscape, the municipal commercial interface, the technology? Mari just referenced 6G, right? I mean, how do you see kind of some of these coming developments impacting the on-the-ground nuts and bolts of infrastructure building, Joan?
Sure. I mean, one of the things I'd like to ask my panel is about technology. Are they doing fiber to the location, fiber to the premises, or are they doing fixed wireless or some of these alternative options, or did they consider it? How did they make the decision? I mean, I think that's definitely an interesting angle to explore. I'm also interested in kind of the ownership models and the management models as we see more government funding coming into this and seeing the states more involved. There's a really interesting thing going on in Vermont where they created, I think it's called a CUD. I don't remember exactly what it stands for, but groups of towns banded together to create these CUDs, and they are getting money from the state that I think originally came from the feds that they can use for networks, but it has to be owned by the community. And so you have service providers that are coming in to build the networks and manage the networks, do the billing and that sort of thing, but they won't be the owner of the network. And if you look at a map of Vermont, I mean, it almost the whole state geographically is in a CUD of one type. I'm calling it a CUD, a CUD of one type or another.
Sounds very unfortunate acronym.
What does it mean long term? If you have this, the cities or these groups of cities, small towns owning, a huge amount of the infrastructure in the state. And it'll be interesting to see how things shape up as more government funding comes into this, and as the states get more involved and local governments get more involved in broadband, how things change.
So, Chris, what are some of your thoughts about the way the funding landscape is changing or promoting, accelerating, putting the pedal on the gas for municipal involvement in these projects?
Well, this is unlike anything we expected. It's unlike anything we've seen before, and is probably unlike anything we will ever experience again, I hope, given what has caused it. But there's an unprecedented amount of money that is available for local governments. There are so many buckets that I fear for anyone who does not have a good tracking system or is trying to, do multiple jobs within a local government while trying to keep track of what's available, what the deadlines are, what the money can be used for. We just this week got the rules from Treasury for the $10 billion coronavirus capital projects fund, and that looks very flexible. It looks like a well-designed program. I haven't read it in depth yet, unfortunately, but my skimming of it suggested that it is really not made the same mistakes we saw from the rescue plan, which is still pretty flexible, but really didn't provide enough flexibility to large cities that have neighborhoods that are poorly served because of affordability issues, for instance. We have money that is potentially coming out with the infrastructure bill. We may actually be getting live updates on that perhaps during the sessions.
Mike,
So,
because there's been a promised vote by the Speaker of the House on September 27th, the very day we'll be holding this conference.
yeah. So Mari called it in the chat. That's great, Jackson. I'm just gonna hold on a second. So I mean, this is an environment in which it's crazy how much is out there, and states are trying to figure it out. They don't have a lot of the capacity. You know, states are trying to hire people. NTIA is trying to hire people. I'm trying to hire people. Like, everyone's trying to find people that are qualified to do this work, and it's an exciting time. This is not going to go by quickly because of supply chain challenges. I wouldn't be surprised if we talk about that a little bit, because that gets in the way. And frankly, it makes partnerships more attractive. I'm strongly supportive of cities deciding to build it their own way if the numbers work out and it looks good to them. But right now, if you can work with someone that has experience with vendors and can be more toward the top of the queue for when product is available, well, that's a good reason to partner. So, it's a time that's exciting, and I think many of us could just work all the time. There's just no end in sight for things we're trying to learn and take care of. But we'll sort it out. And for people who are there in person, I certainly hope we'll be able to continue those discussions afterwards. A little bit of an incentive for those of us who will be masking up and showing up.
Yeah, absolutely right. And thank you for that observation. I think supply chain is very important. We'll be having future Broadband Breakfast Live online events on supply chain, but certainly it will feature, I'm sure, in the conference. Mari, I have to ask you, how did you know? What you put in the chat window that just a few minutes from now, Chris's son is going to walk by. I mean, oh my gosh! Like, if I didn't see this, I wouldn't believe that you completely prophesied that, Mari.
Yeah, well, I did know that there had been a return to virtual schooling, so it seemed like a reasonable prediction to make. I am, as you can see, sequestered away in an office, which is one of the rare times getting back to an office after so many months. But just to piggyback too off of what Chris said, one of the things Chris mentioned, which is the involvement of the states. We at one of our sort of all community meetings earlier in the month, we had Gigi Sohn come in to speak about some of the upcoming funding opportunities. And Chris is right, trying to stay on top of all the pieces, it's mind numbing. But she talked about, in particular, how much the communities need to be coordinating with where they exist with their state broadband offices right now, because there's going to be so much money flowing through there. And the communities that can come in and show, have done some of their due diligence up front and can show where some of their new some of where those new funds can be put to work quickly to connect the unconnected are going to be definitely going to be at an advantage. So I think there's some interesting work to be done, and everywhere people should be doing their homework, and certainly that gives more work for people like Chris and for myself and for many others to be helping these communities figure out how to make the best use of some of these funds. And also agree to the point about, some communities are going to want to do this themselves, but many are going to want to partner, and for many it's going to make sense to partner. And one of the ways I think we think about it is, or we have talked about it in the past, is the idea of instead of municipal owned networks, municipally enabled networks. So the communities sort of taking the reins of what their strategy looks like there, but then, depending on their appetite for risk, or depending on the assets they own, or depending on the supply chain, decide then what partners to work with to make those deployments viable.
Joe, you and I were certainly busy covering the first broadband stimulus in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, and kind of that was really where Broadband Census, the predecessor of Broadband Breakfast, got started, and we certainly covered that rollout. What is different about this effort, Joan, and the others too? But would very much be interested in what feels different, like in terms of what the goals, objectives. Obviously, we've had 10, 12 more years of broadband deployment, so certainly that's been progress. But what do you think that kind of augurs for future broadband developments now?
Do you mean from the regulatory side or more from the technology or business side?
Both sides,
Yeah.
yes.
I mean, I think with regard to policy, the traditional programs were the Universal Service Fund and the USDA Rural Utility Service Grant and Loan Program. It was mostly loans, but you had the Community Connect grants where, money could go to the community, but the budgets for those were relatively low. And people have been saying for years that there's just not enough money there to really achieve universal broadband. And some of the programs were directed to specific types of carriers. Even the first Connect America Fund went, money was offered to the incumbent price cap carriers, the AT&T and Verizons, for their local service territories. And it later looked like maybe that wasn't the best idea because they got money based on a cost model and everybody, I guess, assumed that, oh, no one could do it cheaper than they could because they're already there. But later it was found that when they did this second auction, and a lot of people bid a lot less money than what was based on the cost model, and were willing to deploy networks even faster than what the incumbents had done. So, I mean, I think there's definitely been a shift away from directing money to specific types of businesses. Also a move away from directing money to specific types of technology, and more just setting guidelines, which I think is a good thing moving forward. And on the business side, I mean, you had, going back 20 years, you had all these competitive carriers, and then they kind of a lot of them flamed out, and there were a lot of bankruptcies and so on. But we're starting to see more competitive companies come along again and doing, unusual things, open access models and that type of thing. So, I mean, it's a really exciting time. I think it's people are realizing again that it's, you have also investment money, investment funds coming into the market again, buying up fiber providers and so on. So, I think it's an encouraging time for the whole market.
Yeah, no, great points on both fronts. I just tapped in the chat window about how the Recovery Act really preceded, and the National Broadband Plan, which sort of came along a year afterwards, right? In 2010, the National Broadband Plan put forth a specific idea of changing the Universal Service Fund, or at least it kicked off a process that led to major changes in the Universal Service Fund to a distribution based on a reverse auction, where there's a kind of a bidding process for people to say, hey, I want to offer service and I can do it for cheaper than this person, right? And that kind of goes to the...
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
But there's a bit of a backlash now, I think, against the auction idea, because the most recent auction, the RDOF auction, had a lot of the bids have been questioned. Some people are saying SpaceX shouldn't have won so much money because the satellites are only good for so many years, and why are we putting all this money there? We're having people say some of the companies, bid on areas that are way too big for what they can do. A lot of concerns like that, and the money has been very slowly. I mean, it's only just beginning to be approved to the people who are winning bidders. So what you're seeing with the Senate bill is that there's not much money going to FCC programs, because it almost seems like the legislators weren't happy with the way the auction went, and want to go back to more of a scoring program where you get so many points for this and so many points for that. So it'll be interesting to see how things shape up longer term, because you can argue that if the auction rules were adjusted, to take some of these things into account, like don't allow somebody to bid on a territory that's 10 times the size of what they have now or whatever, that they, perhaps it really would be a more efficient way of distributing things, some argue, and then others, just want to go back to the point system. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there too. And
if I could jump on the tail end of that, I think one of the things that we're seeing is increased responsibility for states to step up. I feel like states weren't taken super seriously by anyone, frankly, for a lot of years. This is sort of like the federal government gave money out to companies, and states more or less watched, some frustrated, some disinterested. Advocates would focus their efforts at the local or federal level. But now, in part because states have created offices, there's a lot of dynamics for why that is. They developed expertise. this is going to be a big test likely in the next 2 years to see whether or not, in some ways, our constitutional system is well designed for getting broadband out there, because we're asking states to step up and take real responsibility, distribute money. And if they do it poorly, it's on them. So it's a whole different landscape.
All right, what are some of your thoughts on this issue of states, and there's a kind of a discussion in the chat window about one-stop shops for broadband grants. I put one there. I'm sure Chris has thoughts on that. Mari, what are some of your thoughts about how people can just absorb the slew and torrent of information about how you fund your broadband project?
Yeah, I wish I had a super easy answer to that. But first, on the state discussion, I completely agree with kind of everything that's been said. There is also, one of the big issues is that some of the states are well prepared for this, or relatively well prepared for this. They have the state broadband offices. They are set up with the human infrastructure to start working through some of the financial disbursement and to work with the communities on their plans. But there are many states that do not have state broadband offices. So it will be very interesting to see how the results compare across, again, the states that we think are better prepared versus the states that may not have had either the ability or the foresight to do some of this. Again, part of the problem too is that of course the states that are best positioned to do that, have these resources in place, are, it's the ones that don't that are going to need the most help, and they're the ones that are going to have the hardest time figuring out how to do good things with the money. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 there, but it is. I think that the coordination between the states and the sort of local communities is going to be critical. In terms of how you pay attention to and how you think through and process and absorb all of the different funding opportunities that are out there. There are a lot of resources. I know Chris and Drew put a couple in the chat. We at US Ignite, we have a tools section up on the top of our website, us-ignite.org. If you go to the tools, there are some funding tools in there to kind of take a look at the availability of funds that are coming down the pike. I mean, again, there's a huge number of different federal agencies here. I don't even think we've talked about the Economic Development Administration is another place that we're going to be seeing different types of funding opportunities. There is effectively no one-stop shop. So it's a lot of work. It is work to be done.
And I just want to complicate what Mari said, because she's right. But there's always little exceptions, and it's fascinating because I've been saying, and people know I'm close with John Chambers in many ways in philosophy. I think Mississippi and Arkansas are two states that are poised to go from some of the worst broadband connectivity to some of the best, in part because electric co-ops are really stepping up, and the states have recognized that they can't rely on the big national monopolies that they had in the past. And so some states, even if they don't do much, by virtue of who is operating and what structures are within their state, may see significant changes in the next few years with the money that's available.
What's your take on that, Joan? I mean, how durable will what's going to come from all this expenditure of money, and how durable will it be, right? I mean, like last round, if you will, 11 years ago, there was a lot of focus on middle mile connections, right? And that was almost a deliberate choice not to kind of step on incumbents' toes on last mile networks. And I'm not sure, the rules haven't been written, right? The bill hasn't even been passed yet, right?
Right.
But what are some of your thoughts on this, Joan?
Well, the idea of stepping on the incumbents is an interesting one because, things have changed a lot for companies like AT&T and Verizon. They're so much more reliant on wireless now. Their business now is so heavily skewed toward wireless and, enterprise type operations. I'm not sure they're going to fight so hard about, losing some of their rural territories. I think they kind of already resigned themselves to that in some ways. And what was the other part of your question? I'm sorry.
Well, how endurable?
Yeah.
durable will changes be, or will investments be?
Right. And that's a really good question, because if you set the bar too low, then you get to a point where you're overbuilding something that you just overbuilt 5 years or so ago. And that happened in a few cases with some of the government funding, because the targets were set relatively low, and some companies, some areas now might be eligible for funding again because the person who took the money last time just did the bare minimum of what they had to do. I think that's a little less likely this time, because especially in the RDOF, for example, people mostly bid to do gigabit service. So once you've got technology out there that does a gigabit, it should be relatively future-proof. Even if things get to 10 gig or something like that, it shouldn't be a huge upgrade to go beyond that. So I don't know. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's very significant, and I think that it's important to sort of start talking those speeds up, right?
Yeah.
The 25.3 still exists in FCC policy, but it's kind of been undercut again by the only Senate passed bill, which puts in a requirement for 100 by 20. And Chris, we've both written a fair bit about the bill. What are some thoughts you have on that, and whether that's kind of suitable, or whether there should be a push to make it more like 100 or 1,000 times 1,000?
Yeah, I guess I get too complicated about this, and I feel like people's eyes start to glaze over, because I feel like there's actually different numbers we need to talk about. One is how we prioritize where investments are made. And so, that, it still makes sense perhaps to say 25.3 is areas that are the most in need in rural America. But at the same time, this whole idea of unserved versus served has always been not that useful in taking into account complications like affordability, reliability, whether or not there's high quality access truly available. Now, if you're taking government money to build out a network, I think that absolutely it needs to be something that is going to last for the long haul. We should not be subsidizing the same households in a region for infrastructure, multiple times. We should be making sure that we do it one time, we do it correctly, I think. But I also think that we have a challenge in that no one takes the FCC seriously. If we go back for a second, Gigi Sohn recognized that some people wanted to dismantle the FCC because they didn't like the way it was regulating on net neutrality and things like that. And unfortunately, the FCC has been kind of made irrelevant in some ways. Its definition for broadband is ignored by Congress, which routinely sets more realistic times. No one believes it's the only time people talk about FCC data for deployment as to where availability is to laugh at it. Most of us have even given up on whether or not the FCC's new information will be relevant once it's posted, or if we'll have another several years of refining it before it's useful. We might see the FCC be 2-to-1 Republican versus Democrat, in January, because we haven't seen an FCC chair appointed. It's a weird time in that way. And so, it is kind of a free for all. And frankly, I would say that regarding Joan's comments on RDOF, which were correct, I think one of the reasons we saw bidding the way we did is because there is an expectation among ISPs, big and among the more adventurous small ones, that the FCC can be lied to, the FCC will not enforce its own rules, and that they can get away with things. And frankly, I think they're right in some cases, and I think a few businesses are really going to suffer as the FCC makes an example out of them, but a lot of folks may get away with violating the rules and just having any enforcement buried deep down inside of some docket that hardly anyone reads.
Well, no, interesting thoughts, very much so, as to what the FCC is going to do, how they're going to do. We are again kind of looking forward. We hope to be able to announce a keynote speaker or two for the event in the next few days before the event on Monday. I want to just remind everyone that this great group of moderators, Joan Engerbertson, Chris Mitchell, and Mari Silby, will all be either in person or live online. And we're basically going to have a mix, right? Every panel is going to have people who are there in person and who are remote. So it will be an interesting experiment, just like we've begun doing hybrid events. I certainly don't want to keep our moderators here longer than they need to. Let's just give everyone a minute or so to kind of wrap up maybe what you're most looking forward to learning about this topic of digital infrastructure investment, even a question of your own that you've got, or if you're going to be there for the whole conference, what you're looking forward to learning or catching up at Broadband Communities. And let's just go around in the order, Joan, Chris, and Mari.
So as you know, I'm executive editor at Telecompetitor. So we are focused on broadband. A lot of our readers are service providers of all different types. And so I write, probably a half dozen articles or so every week about broadband and related topics. So I'm looking to get some things I can write about from this. And I've been doing a lot lately with, new funding sources and new business models. And certainly this panel looks like a great potential source for new information on those areas.
Great. Well, thanks, Joan. Always good to come back to that, us reporters, right? Okay, Chris.
Well, first of all, I'm disappointed that I probably won't be meeting Joan in person, because I think it's been a lot of years that I've been following your work, and we still never actually met up in person, I think. I'm excited to see all of the panels, frankly, and I feel like it's a high bar. I think right now, this is a time in which one of the things that we have to do is figure out how to speak to people who are just getting into this space. And I'm really hoping that my panel will offer information that will be relevant both for people that are new, that maybe this is among their first conferences as they see opportunities available with the funds, as well as people that have been there for, I don't know, I think this is my 13th time, something like that. So, I think we're going to try and get a lot of information out. And let me say, I should have finished up my previous comment by just saying that the FCC is really important and we need it to do a good job. So I'm not in favor of it being irrelevant, but I worry about current trends pushing it in that direction. So I'll be trying to not shoot my mouth off too much. Usually when I'm actually moderating, I try to do a better job of letting the panelists lead the show. So it's going to be a good time.
I was going to say, tell us how you really feel, Chris, about our federal government. I too, I'm very much looking forward to all of the panels here. I think it's interesting. One of the things that didn't come up so much in our discussion today is kind of where the industry players are at this point in this conversation. How ready are they to deal with some of these changes that are coming? I mean, there's been ample warning for sure that some of these trends are happening, but I'm really curious. The traditional players, the tower companies, the carriers, all of these folks. How ready do they think they are? And the proof will be in the pudding. How ready are they actually to deal with some of these changes in deployment models and how things are funded, and how things get, how infrastructure is used and shared and all of those things. So I think that will be another interesting angle to see how much we can suss out next week.
Well, this has been great, and we really do try to have something of use and of value for each of you who sign up to attend our free Broadband Breakfast Live Online events every Wednesday at 12 noon. We encourage you to continue to come back at this time for our free events. We are entering a new age, this hybrid age, and next Monday will be a real test of that for both virtual moderators and virtual attendees, virtual panelists, but there will be a core group there in Houston at Broadband Communities Summit. The page to get all the information for the event is in the chat bar. If you're not watching via Zoom, it's broadbandbreakfast.com/DII for digital infrastructure investment. I also just want to give a shout out to the sponsors for our digital infrastructure investment event. They are Lit Communities, Broadband Money, I put that in the chat bar earlier, kind of trying to be a one-stop shop, maybe not complete, but trying to be that for entities. Broadband Now, Render Networks, Sci-Fi Networks, Utopia Fiber, Positron Access, and the California Emerging Technology Fund. Thank you to each of our sponsors, both for our digital infrastructure investment and for our regular weekly Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We will see you all next Wednesday, but I certainly hope to welcome as many of you as possible to Houston or to our event. Please visit Digital Infrastructure Investment and register to attend. Until next Monday, I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, and saying so on behalf of Joan Engelbertson, Chris Mitchell, and Mari Silby. I can't believe I made that mistake, but thank you again to all of you for being here, and we'll see you next Monday. Take care. Bye-bye.